We're here today with Katelyn Beaty, the author of a new book titled Celebrities for Jesus: How Personas, Platforms, and Prophets Are Hurting the Church. Katelyn is a writer, journalist, editor, and keen observer of trends in the American church. She's written for the New York Times, The New Yorker, The Washington Post, Religion News Service, Religion and Politics, and The Atlantic, and has commented on faith and culture for CNN, ABC, NPR, the Associated Press, and the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. She also co-hosts the Saved by the City podcast, which is part of Religion News Service. And Katelyn previously served as the print managing editor at Christianity Today and is also the author of another book titled A Woman's Place, A Christian Vision for Your Calling in the Office, the Home, and the World. You can learn more about all of Katelyn's work at KatelynBeaty.com. So Katelyn, it's really a great privilege to be able to catch up with you again. I should have mentioned maybe also that Katelyn and I have collaborated a few different times going back to probably 2015 or so, something like that. But but Katelyn, congratulations on all your great work.
Thanks so much, Brian. Thanks for the warm introduction.
Well, I was really happy to see this new book because, you and I have been dealing with this whole celebrity issue within the book publishing industry for quite some time. And so
yes,
talk about that more in a moment. But maybe you could just kind of give folks a little bit more details about, Katelyn. What would you like people to know that I didn't touch on?
Oh, well, I am recording this in my apartment in Brooklyn, New York. So I've lived in New York for coming up on 4 years. But before that was in the Midwest the rest of my life. I grew up in Ohio, went to school in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and then lived in the Chicago suburbs for a long time. So New York is different from the Midwest in a lot of ways. And, we're coming up on, 2+ years of the city navigating life in a pandemic. But I think, things are slowly returning back to a more livable situation. And so I work remotely for Brazos Press. I am the editorial director of that division of Baker Publishing Group. And when I'm not writing and editing and podcasting, I love just walking everywhere in New York. In the spring and the fall, I really enjoy bird watching. That's something that I learned from my parents and I get to do with them. And just enjoying all the cultural offerings of New York. But I do miss my family. I do have a nephew who is 3. So I feel the pull of the heartstrings. So I try to get home to Ohio, every quarter, but I still love being in New York. So yeah, that's a little bit about me beyond the professional world.
Good. Thank you. So before we get into the new book, you want to talk a little bit about some of the previous things you've written?
Some of the previous things I've written.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So when I worked at Christianity Today magazine, I was writing and reporting on many trends in American evangelicalism. CT is the flagship evangelical magazine founded by Billy Graham in the 50s. And then I left in 2016, and that was a big year in our political and cultural life. And so all of a sudden I was thrust into a conversation about how evangelicals, especially evangelical women, were responding to the election of former President Trump. And so, in that post-CT time, I was writing a lot about how the Trump presidency was affecting American evangelicals. Obviously, I was part of the 19% of white voting evangelicals who did not support Trump. And that created a lot of division and pain and angst for the church. So I wrote a lot about that. I have also, I pick a lot of light topics. Sometimes I write about sexual ethics in the church. I've written a little bit about deconstruction among younger Christians, and then have also tackled issues with ghostwriting and plagiarism in the book publishing world. So I suppose that a common thread is going there, but, trying to help readers engage complex issues in the church with nuance. And that's, of course, what I'm hoping to do with this new book as well.
Yeah, so speaking of which, I mentioned the title is Celebrities for Jesus, How Personas, Platforms, and Prophets Are Hurting the Church. What drove you to do all the work necessary to write that book?
So the origins of this book really started while I was still an editor at Christianity Today, and our staff received several tips about kind of famous household name type celebrity Christian leaders who were being credibly accused of various moral failings. And at least in 3 of those circumstances, over time, the tips would prove to be true, and CT would have to report this news about the fallen leader. And it was just so, it was so personally discouraging to realize that not every famous, beloved leader is who they present themselves to be in the public square. And so really asking, is there something about celebrity power that actually is connected to abuses of power? Obviously, we see that in broader conversations about the Me Too movement and abuses of power in Hollywood and the entertainment industry, but how celebrity can so often shield people from accountability. But also really wanting to ask, is there something about the American church in this moment where we're tempted to put people on pedestals that no mortal can actually reasonably bear without proper checks and balances? Why do we keep putting people on pedestals, and how can we recover a vision of ordinary faithfulness? Because it's easy to kind of look at the fallen leaders and say, oh, the problem is them. But in fact, there were thousands, millions of people who supported their ministries, bought their books, listened to their sermons, went to their churches, that kind of helped put them on the pedestal. So I think we kind of lay Christians are implicated in this problem as well as the individual leaders.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So for whom would you say that the book is most intended?
So I have, of course, every book author is like, well, it's intended for everybody. Everybody should read this book. But I think primarily my hoped for audience, and I think the people who would most resonate with this are people who are in the church or have been in the church and have been either harmed by or discouraged by these headlines that we've seen in recent years, and are really asking, why does this keep happening and how can we prevent it? So people who are really concerned about the getting at the oxymoron of Christian celebrity, recognizing there's a dissonance there, and so much of what happens in American Christendom actually seems to be very little about the person of Christ. So I think it's really for people who are discouraged, have been harmed, but want a more hopeful and healthier future for the church, and really want to capture that vision of ordinary faithfulness. What does my life matter in the grand scheme of things if I don't have a social media following, if people aren't buying my books, if I'm not on a stage or on a platform? And is it possible that actually, those acts of ordinary faithfulness, they carry as much, if not more, kind of eternal weight as do the acts done kind of for everybody to see. Jesus says something about doing your acts of goodness and charity in private so that it's between you and God, not for other people to kind of praise you.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So what are some of the characteristics that you talk about in the book of celebrities that are hurting the church?
So I think one common thread is that at least the celebrities that I describe in the book tend to be very charismatic people. They are very passionate, visionary, are able to gather crowds with kind of the vision that they cast. They're often very excellent, gifted communicators and speakers. People, flock to listen to them. In the church world, there's definitely, at least in American evangelicalism, there is a kind of preference for white men, kind of young white men taking the helm. There are lots of reasons for that. They're kind of mixed in with a charisma, tends to be probably a touch of egotism, kind of thinking like we can reinvent church from the ground up. It takes a little bit of self-confidence to think that you can do that. There is what can happen with a lot of these celebrity leaders is that they surround themselves with people who, or attract people who on the surface, or at least in appearance, seem to be offering accountability, but in actuality or in practice tend to be supporters. They tend to be people who are too afraid to speak up to the celebrity leader, get something from their proximity to the celebrity leader, or really like look up to the celebrity leader as a mentor or a hero in the faith. And so the power differential creates a lack of accountability. And that's where, of course, so many abuses and improprieties can seep in. Obviously celebrity in our time greatly depends on mass media, the use of the tools of mass media to project a cultivated image or personal brand that people can engage you, but it's ultimately, it's simulated intimacy. It's false intimacy. But the tools of mass media kind of allow you to offer that to many more people than would ever possibly know you as a person in real life. So that would be one kind of core characteristic of celebrity in the modern world. The definition that I really stuck with for this book was social power without proximity. The ability to shape and influence how people think and feel, but without necessarily being known or knowing. The kind of a lack of close, intimate relationship, which is what we all need, not only to flourish as human beings made in the image of God, but also to steward our power or lead in any capacity we need to stay grounded, in real life relationship and life lived kind of off the stage and off the screen, in order to be healthy, in order to lead in the way that I think God would want us to lead.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So both of us have been around the book publishing world for a few years now, and we've both commented on how, for some publishing houses, what matters most in getting a book deal is the size of the author's platform.
Mm-hmm.
How have you seen that trending lately?
I see it trending upward.
Really?
Well, I should say, of course, not every publisher, of course, not every Christian book publisher. There's a variety of book publishers. Some are owned by a kind of mainstream national conglomerate, and others are independently owned or driven by more kind of missional or kind of theological concerns. So of course there's a spectrum. I would say though that, more than half of all Christian publishing imprints are owned by these huge, mainstream media corporations. And so there is, over time, of course, an increased pressure to sell books. And, I work for a publisher that also wants to sell books. Book publishing is a business. And of course there is, there's nothing wrong as a business wanting to create profit. That said, because we are in an attention economy, a media economy where celebrity works, celebrity really sells, there is pressure over time, I think, for lots of publishers to partner with authors based not so much on quality of writing or content or wisdom or maturity, but what is your following? How many people follow you online? how many people listen to your podcast or YouTube channel, how many people attend your church that will, buy the book when it comes out. So you really see that, I think, undue emphasis on numbers and at the expense of other really important concerns like, quality of writing and theological depth and wisdom and even originality of ideas. So one thing I say in the book is that if you have 100,000 TikTok followers, but have trouble, stringing a sentence together, you'll probably get some kind of book offer. And then the publisher will figure out what to do with your lack of writing skill later. You could hire a ghostwriter, you could have an editor really do like a heavy-handed writing, editing, essentially. But if you are, by contrast, a really great writer that has very little to no following, you're going to struggle. You're going to struggle to get a foot in the door for most book publishers because of the platform issue. So, it's not to say that questions of platform and potential readership aren't important. At Brazos, we of course look at that, but can we bring that into balance with some of these other concerns and create a more balanced and holistic way of assessing, which books we should publish.
Well, just like with so many other important issues, there's a tension between, substance versus, platform in this case, right?
Mm-hmm.
And, one extreme or the other tends to be an issue. Whereas, as you said, balancing them, I think is a really nuanced and important skill set. But it seems like the trend, over the past few years has been so much more of a focus on celebrity to the extent of substance in book quality overall. I mean, absolutely many exceptions, your publisher and several others that I work with, but overall, I think it's a big issue in the book industry and for society more generally.
Yeah. And I think, I write a whole chapter in the book on the publishing industry. And of course, I expect that some other industry insiders will read that chapter. And so it's kind of a message to them. But I think I also wanted to write about that because I don't know how your average kind of Christian reader, like how much they know about the industry and how it works.
Yeah.
And maybe just bringing that to bear in determining which book you're going to buy or get from the, just how do we assess these books as books and recognizing that there's not the kind of vetting always that you might expect if you're just a lay reader and don't know how the industry works as a whole.
And if, you're purchasing a book to try to learn something, I mean, who do you want to learn it from? And what kind of bias or what kind of depth are they coming to the table with?
Right. Yeah. It's a very good questions.
So I'd like to read from a couple of the endorsements for the book. This one's from Jamar Tisby. He says, in this stupendously convicting and well-researched book, Katelyn Beaty probes the soul of the celebrity pastor, and even more hauntingly, she examines how we, the people, help create such larger-than-life figures. So could you describe some of the research that you did for this book?
Yeah, well, I have a chapter on Billy Graham and other kind of key, what I argue are the kind of key evangelical celebrities of the late 19th and 20th centuries. So was doing a lot of reading of biographies. I also have a chapter on Willow Creek Community Church in the Chicago suburbs and looking at that as, as an emblem of the megachurch model and the way that megachurches can tend to elevate or center themselves on one charismatic leader, oftentimes someone who ends up becoming like a celebrity. So I actually spoke with several former Willow Creek either attendees or leaders kind of in the aftermath of the scandal involving the founding pastor Bill Hybels, really getting an inside look at their experiences inside the church, and how those metrics of accountability or lack of proximity kind of came into place over time. For the chapter on abuses of power, of course, I was reading resources on and interviewing people who were whistleblowers, or who were actually abused themselves by celebrity leaders, and talking about how there's often a larger than life dynamic that can come into play, and the ways that even entire institutions can come to kind of rally around a beloved figure who's being credibly accused of bad things. I did speak with people inside the Christian publishing industry. Most of those people chose to speak off record. Because they want to keep their jobs, and they wanted to be able to speak freely about some of the things that concern them. So a lot of historical research. I think I probably did 20 to 25 interviews over the last, year and a half. And it's really bringing that historical, cultural, and theological assessment of how we got here and where we go from here.
So in one of the other endorsements, that James Harvey says that media stardom is a relatively new phenomenon, but the corrosiveness of power and authority is not. For me, the whole greed for power is just such a fundamental issue for many of the serious issues that afflict our society today.
Mm-hmm.
In the book, do you have suggestions for how we address this? Big issue, I know.
Well, I do say in the last chapter, if you are reading this book hoping for like a how-to guide on how to weed out celebrity from the church, this is probably not the book for you. My strength is more analysis than spiritual kind of preaching. I will say though, a few things that I do mention in the final chapter, not just talking about accountability, but examining our systems of accountability to see if they actually work, and if they can really kind of stand up to the power of a celebrity figure. So not just talking a good talk about accountability, but like really examining what do we have in place. When it comes to pastoral or church leadership, hiring decisions, looking for people who actually don't want to be celebrities. The only people I trust who are like healthy celebrities are the people who really were not seeking it at all, and who it just kind of came to because of good things. But I think, churches, elder boards, becoming, ministry boards, becoming wise about who they put in the spotlight, looking for characteristics of humility, teachability, people who welcome accountability, people who can withstand disagreement and not everybody agreeing with them all the time. People who are honest, obviously, who don't demand a kind of privacy, or don't demand secrecy, I should say, who want to live with integrity. So I think seminaries can do a lot of work there, but I think it also comes down to kind of a wisdom in hiring and not being overly dazzled by teaching ability and communication ability alone, and stop putting, not putting so much emphasis on, is this person a great public speaker? I really think too, a related conversation here is just the American church's fixation, and many other people have written about this, but the fixation on numbers and growth, and doing the thing that works that leads to growth, and having a very utilitarian or even capitalistic understanding of the spiritual life, and really just getting over our fixation on numbers. And it's not to say that growth is inherently bad, but how you grow is as important as the growth itself. And if it's just about growth, what can end up happening is that you allow somebody to continue to lead who, when they fall, they end up doing so much more damage than if you had put somebody in place who could just steadily, faithfully, consistently lead as a Christian. So growth is not worth it when you look at the after effects, because then you're talking about negative effects of people being hurt by the church, leaving the church, and in the broader public square, Christianity getting a really bad rap and hurting its own credibility, right? So definitely getting over that fixation on numbers-based growth, I think, is important for all of us.
Kind of avoiding the short-term fix at the expense for the long-term,
right.
damage.
Right.
Yeah. So I know you're in the middle of launching this new book, but looking forward, is there anything you can talk about in terms of future writing projects or other work?
A couple other people have asked me that. I'm like, I just need to get this book out first.
That's fine. That's fine.
Several people have asked over the years, oh, would you ever write a book about sexual ethics in the church? It's something I care about, but honestly, it scares me to wade into that kind of issue in such a public way. I'm very much, of course, I continue to watch arguably the unraveling of white evangelicalism from a political and cultural standpoint. And so kind of post-Trump looking at the rise of conspiracy theories and an alignment between white evangelicals and QAnon. Kind of where does that leave the younger generation? I'm very interested in that. But I will let you know if and when I've decided on the next book project.
I know. These things take time anyway, so.
Yes.
So again, the title of the new book is Celebrities for Jesus, How Personas, Platforms, and Prophets Are Hurting the Church. You can learn more at KatelynBeaty.com. Katelyn, congratulations on this great piece of work. I'm so glad that you're shedding a light on something that's a very pressing and, as we've said, kind of underappreciated, under-recognized issue.
Yeah, thanks so much, Brian. Thanks for your questions and for opening up this conversation.
Thank you.